Okay, so we talked a lot about ions and solutes and compounds that can cross the membrane. Now let's talk more about how they can cross the membrane. So in general, there are two broad categories of membrane transport. We have passive transport and we have active transport. So examples of passive transport include diffusion, facilitated diffusion, and osmosis. Now, what's the difference between passive and active transport? The thing about active transport, passive transport occurs spontaneously. It does not require additional energy. So active transport, on the other hand, so this can't occur on, active transport cannot occur spontaneously. You need additional energy to actually accomplish active transport. So things like primary active transport, the energy comes from ATP. You probably learned this in general biology or cell and molecular biology. So primary active transport, ATP is the driver. If it uses ATP, it's primary. Now, is that the only energy source? ATP is a major energy source in the body, but it's not the only energy source. So secondary active transport can use chemical gradients. And again, gradients is just a fancy term meaning a difference in concentration in this case. So if there's a difference in concentration between the inside and the outside of a cell and for a chemical, so the thing about these chemical gradients and these differences in concentration, by stacking it unevenly on either side of the membrane, this actually is a form of potential energy. So secondary active transport uses this potential energy from this difference, because what happens if you open up the membrane and just allow a difference in concentration to freely diffuse between sides of the membrane? Well, it's going to try to balance itself out. So by kind of separating it and causing an unequal distribution, this potential energy can be used to transport other solutes as well. And then you have endocytosis and exocytosis. I won't cover that in detail. That's more of like, it's like a general basic, but I'll think I'll leave that more for your MD6 or MD4. Okay, let's start off with diffusion, the easiest form of transport. And I can summarize diffusion in just three words: high to low. And by high, I mean from higher concentration to lower concentration. Here we have two solutions, and as you can see, the solution on the right, now they both have the equal amount of water molecules, but the solution on the right has way more sodium ions than the one on the left. What happens if we remove the barrier between the two solutions? Well, we remove the barrier, and what we see is that the sodium molecules will diffuse and distribute themselves relatively evenly throughout the solution. And the thing is, like, okay, they won't be moving around at equilibrium, but now we see that they spread out, they're more evenly distributed, and now the previous compartments have roughly the same amount of sodium ions. So this is diffusion. There was no additional, this happened spontaneously just due to energetics and the movement of the molecules. And this happens spontaneously. No ATP, no nothing else. It's just high concentration to low concentration. So diffusion, you probably learned about this during your undergrad years. Really simple, right? Well, let's get a little more into detail. Now you're in med school. So let's talk about fixed laws of diffusion. The more fixed laws of diffusion, well, there are two laws, fixed laws of diffusion. The first law, it refers to this equation. It's summed up in this equation. It's like, oh, what's all this? No numbers there, right? Okay, because now you're in med school. You're no longer in undergrad. All right, so J refers to diffusion flux, and to put it simply, just think of it as the overall movement and rate of movement of whatever molecule is diffusing. Now, right, what that negative d, so that d refers to a diffusion coefficient, which is a constant. We'll cover more about the diffusion coefficient when we talk about the respiratory system and respiratory physiology. Now, what do we have right next to the d to the right of that? So we have derivatives. I know I was advising a pre-med and they said, like, when am I ever going to use calculus? I'm like, you see calculus in med school and this is where you see it. So this is calculus. So the C refers to concentration, and X, this refers to a location. So in this case, we're referring to one-dimensional diffusion. I know that because like three-dimensional, that would be make it a little more complicated, but we're just talking about concentration and differences in concentration and depend between two different locations. Now, there is another law of diffusion. Now, there is a second law of diffusion, and I won't cover it as much. I can cover it during the live Q&A session if you really want me to. Fick's first law is the one that has more application to respiratory physiology. But Fick's second law is more like talking about the actual physics of it. So what we have here are partial derivatives, and not only that, we have a double partial derivative. So it's talking about the difference in concentration, or how much the concentration changes over time, depends on the double derivative, partial derivative of the concentration and the locations. So again, concentrate more on the Fick's first law, and we will cover it a little more in the respiratory physiology lectures. All right, so Fick's first law. So the easy way I like to do this is like, okay, it seems very abstract. So when you have a lot of, this is the thing about physiology. Physiologists love equations. They love abstract graphs that are very abstract and hard to get at face value. When we start breaking it down and doing things like plugging in numbers, they start to make a little more sense. So I'm going to have a drawing exercise.